Well, welcome. I'm so glad that you've joined me. Process of raising funds and growing stewards for a new church start. My name is Ben Ingebretson, and it's my privilege to guide you through 5 training segments relative to this subject. Let me tell you a little bit about my background in stewardship development and raising resources. For quite a number of years, I worked with an organization called International Steward, in which we worked with developing ministries around the world in primarily Southeast Asia and continental Africa, helping them achieve sustainability and be released from the crippling effects of external dependency. You perhaps have heard stories where small little nonprofits in the developing world suddenly are cut off from Western resources, and then they die quickly because they never really developed local sustainability, local giving for their ministries. And so I was involved in that for quite some time and have used many of those principles along with other principles to work with church planters for the last 15 years to help them grow ministries that are locally sustainable and not dependent on external funds any longer than is absolutely necessary. So this training is really going to have 2 dimensions to it. One, it's going to have a dimension that's going to relate to church planters or developers who need to raise startup funds in order for their church plant, their ministry, just to get the capital they need just to go through the start phase towards sustainability. And then the other dimension of this training will involve those that are leading congregations or are pastoral developers who then have a congregating group that they need to cultivate the values and the practice of stewardship. So both of those individuals, whether you're, again, during the developing early phase of a church plant, or whether you're congregating and you have a group of people that need to grow up as stewards, I think you'll find, I trust, helpful material in this training. You know, most ministry leaders are uncomfortable about talking about money. I mean, we don't want to preach about it, or rather uncomfortable about the notion of being paid for it sometimes, although we really want a paycheck. We kind of feel like the whole subject is a necessary evil, a means to an end, that asking for money is like begging. We wish somebody else could do this piece of work so we could just do the ministry. And so I want to acknowledge that many of us coming into this just like this is the last thing we wanted to sign up for when we got invited to be involved in developing a new ministry. Henry Nouwen, many of you know him as an amazing theologian and spiritual director and writer. Henry Nouwen understood the place you may find yourself in today. And he has a book that I would encourage you to order if you have a chance. It's relatively inexpensive. It's just a booklet called Spirituality of Fundraising. The Spirituality of Fundraising. Let me read to you a couple of lines, actually a couple of paragraphs from Nouwen. Nouwen says, fundraising is a subject we seldom think about from a spiritual perspective. We may think of fundraising as a necessary but unpleasant activity to support spiritual things. Or we might believe that fundraising reflects a failure to plan well or to trust enough that God will provide all of our needs. Indeed, quite often fundraising is a response to a crisis. Suddenly our organization or faith community does not have enough money, and we begin to say, how are we going to get the money we need? How are we going to start asking for it? Then we realize we're not used to doing this, and we may feel awkward, even a little embarrassed about it. We begin to wonder, who will give us money? How will we ask them? From the perspective of the gospel, fundraising is not a response to a crisis. Fundraising is, first and foremost, a form of ministry. It's a way of announcing our vision and inviting other people into our mission. Vision and mission are central to the life of God's people. And without vision, we perish. Without mission, we lose our way. Vision brings together needs and resources to meet those needs. Vision also shows us new directions and opportunities for our mission. Vision gives us courage to speak when we might want to be silent. Fundraising is proclaiming what we believe in such a way that we offer people an opportunity to participate with us in this vision and mission God has given to us. Fundraising is precisely the opposite of begging. When we seek to raise funds, we are not saying, please could you help us out because lately it's been hard. But rather we're declaring we have a vision that's amazing and exciting, and we're inviting you to invest yourself and the resources that God has entrusted to you in this great adventure that God has called us into. Well, that's a tease from Henry Nouwen. I hope that you'll pick up that book, The Spirituality of Fundraising. It's only about 25 pages, but it's really, really good stuff, and it'll hopefully be motivational for you. In our training, we want to cover 5 dimensions in order to get at the kind of outcome that Nouwen is describing, a kind of confidence that you will have that will propel you more effectively in this work of developing a stewardship culture and raising startup funds. So we're going to begin with a biblical conversation about the scriptural references that support this kind of work, and then we're going to talk about strategic planning and leading change and organizational worthiness and skills and methods. That's the way our time is going to break down together. Begin with me with the why question. Why comes before how. The biblical foundation for stewardship development really rests on 3 realities. Number 1, heard this before, undoubtedly, but let's just linger for a moment. God owns it all. God owns it all from the perspective of creation, and therefore, because God rightfully owns all things as creator, there's really no shortage of resources. There is, however, a shortage of stewards, a shortage of givers. So we just begin with a simple notion that God is rightful owner of all things, and that being the case, there really is no shortage of resources. The shortage comes at a different juncture. The shortage comes at the level of stewardship, which brings us to the second biblical point, that people manage. Genesis chapter 1 gives us the biblical roots of this when God commanded Adam and Eve to take charge and steward the garden that they were placed in. Some of the older translations say have dominion. Really, the better rendering there is to be stewards of the creation, that the role of Adam and Eve, the role of humanity, is to steward God's great creation. This comes up in the Gospels also, Matthew chapter 25, Jesus' parables, that we're called to be in a stewardship relationship with God's world, and that every decision that's made is a stewardship choice. It's not, as some of us may have been raised in a worshiping community where there was the stewardship moment, right? And the offering plate came down the pew and you put in your offering. No, there is no such thing as a stewardship moment. Every choice is a stewardship choice. How I steward my time, how I steward my resources, how I steward the day that's before me. Every choice is a stewardship choice. And so this really calls for us to think about every day of the week and every moment and every activity as a conversation potentially around stewardship development. The biblical word for stewardship is the word oikonomos in the New Testament. It occurs a dozen or so times. And it's important to note that biblical word oikonomos really comes out in 3 characteristics. First of all, a steward is faithful. You maybe have heard Paul's words before. It's required that stewards be found faithful. And you'll find other biblical texts in 1 Corinthians 4, Luke chapter 12, 1 Peter 4:10 that use that word oikonomos relative to the faithful qualities of a steward. So stewards are faithful and they're wise. Who then is the faithful and wise steward that the master has put in charge? There's a quote out of one of Luke's parables of Jesus, Luke chapter 12, 19, and Luke chapter 19, along with Matthew chapter 25. Some parables that use that word oikonomos and use it around this quality of wisdom. So stewards must be faithful That is, they must use the resources that belong not to themselves, but to the rightful owner. They must use them in accordance with the owner's designs and purposes, but then they must be wise in making those stewardship selections, faithful and wise. And then finally, the third dimension character quality that Jesus calls out and identifies is accountability. Stewards are accountable. And he called them, saying, "Give an account of your stewardship." Luke chapter 16. Again, these three qualities, character qualities, are what Jesus himself identifies as being the character of a steward. And the scope of that stewardship involves, yes, our physical bodies, our gifts and abilities, our time, our money. So we begin with the biblical teaching that God owns it all. If God owns it all, there's no shortage of resources for his mission in the world. But there is a shortage at the point of stewards. And Jesus identifies the qualities of a steward: faithful, wise, accountable. And the New Testament gives us a sense of the scope of that stewardship, of our physical bodies, our gifts and abilities, our time, and our money. Which brings us then to the third biblical teaching about stewardship, and that is, and here's the one that many of us have to linger with. Stewardship is a learned behavior. It's not intuitive. None of us wake up in the morning naturally feeling like we're a steward. In fact, actually, we think 180 degrees opposite. I began to think, well, this is my day, and what'll I do with my day? This is my time. It's my money in my back pocket. It's my schedule, and kind of on it goes. We slip into the pronoun, the I pronoun, the my pronoun, the possessive pronoun, really easily. And that's not the perspective of the New Testament, as we've already learned. So Paul has some words for Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 11 through 19. And it's a pretty important section of Scripture that I would strongly recommend that you spend some time and reflect on and think about how this can instruct all of us as developers. Because Timothy was a developer, he was a church planter. Paul tells him in verse 17, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them," Paul says, "not to be haughty or to set their hopes in the uncertainty of riches, but rather to set their hopes on God, who richly provides for us everything that we enjoy. They're to be good and to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a foundation for the future so that they can take hold of the life that's truly life." Notice, Paul does not tell Timothy, make a little suggestion, drop a hint, give a nudge. No, Paul uses fairly strong words with Timothy. He says, charge them. Timothy, you're going to have to be direct in your communication. You're going to have to be gracious, for sure, and wise and effective as a developer of stewardship in the lives of others. But you can't shrink back from this subject, Timothy. You have to be courageous about this. Because, Timothy, we're not talking about your salary. We're not talking about your need to get by this month. We're not talking about your struggle to meet your budget for your church plant or your project in your ministry. We're talking about the need of others to come to terms with the fact that God is the owner of all things and they are only managers, and that one day they'll be held accountable for that which they've been given to manage. And so it's your job, Timothy, to stir up within others the quality of faithfulness and wisdom as stewards, such that they grow in the grace of generosity and they take hold of the life that's truly life, Paul says. I mean, this is the joy of giving, as Jesus says, it's more blessed to be the giver. That's what we want people to take hold of, is the joy of generosity. And it's your job, Timothy, to be an activator, stimulator of that process in the lives of others. They don't go there naturally, right? Stewardship is a learned behavior. It's not intuitive. I open my billfold, and there you go, my billfold. And I pull out my $20 bill and I decide how I'm going to spend it. I think of, well, I gave God, his 10%, and now I keep the other 90% for myself. See, that's not reckoning with what Scripture really teaches, that God's the rightful owner of all things, that every act is a stewardship act, that I'm charged with being a steward as one who is to be faithful and wise and accountable, and that stewardship is not going to come intuitively. It's something I'm going to have to learn over time. It's interesting to me how oftentimes individuals a little further on in the life journey begin to finally wrap their brains around this. They can't take it with them. It's all been a gift, and it's all flowing through their hands. And those that are a little further along, oftentimes in the journey of life, they begin to think more wisely about being stewards, managers of all the good things that have come into their lives as they pass them on to a new generation, pass them on to others in order to accomplish the purposes that they value, that they believe that God values if they're a Christian or if they're faith-based in their orientation. So these biblical realities have to sink deep down inside of us as planter developers. Or we go to that place that Henry Nouwen described, a place of embarrassment, of awkwardness, social awkwardness. Like, I'm sorry I have to talk with you about your money and my ministry. You see, that's just a killer in the motivation that's required to do this kind of work. That asset that is in the hands of a friend of yours is not theirs. They are a temporary manager of it. One day they'll be held accountable for it. In the meantime, if they want to grow as a steward, they must become wise and faithful. And it's your job to be a stimulator of that. Paul says to Timothy, provoke those, challenge those who have means to be generous. And the text there in 1 Timothy is really worth stapling up on your wall somewhere as a motivator to you as a developer to similarly be bold and courageous. Now, I've included in the slide series a little quote from the Screwtape Letters. I love C.S. Lewis, maybe you do too. Screwtape has these words: a sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership which sound equally funny in heaven and hell. We produce this sense of ownership not only by pride, but by confusion. We teach them not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, my dog, my boots, my wife, my God. All the time the joke is on the word mine. In the end, they will most certainly find out to whom things belong. Certainly not to them. So there's a Screwtape perspective on how it is that our enemy would reframe the true reality that we have to constantly be striking, a God perspective on with others. So getting perspective here again, given the number of references and the theological significance of stewardship in both testaments, we have to conclude that stewardship is not just what you must do in order to do real ministry. This is not a means to an end. This is not a necessary evil kind of an activity. Stewardship development, growing others, helping them grow in the grace of giving and taking hold of the life that's truly life, helping them reframe their entire lives as stewards and not as owners. That activity is ministry. It is growing disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Again, many of us have to constantly work on reframing the work we do in this area, or the motivation to get out there and do it just falls off the table right away. Come with me to one or two final slides here before we bring this first episode in our training to a close. This slide is one that we'll come back to that gives a picture of the developmental phases that most people will go through as they grow in the path of becoming a steward of all that God has given them in the fullest sense of the word. That is to say that many of us begin at the level of fear. It's my money and I need every dime, and so please stay away from this kind of a conversation. And then we reckon with the truth that maybe it isn't mine, because one day I will have to leave it behind. And then we feel guilty about our attitude towards the resources in our back pocket and in our bank accounts. And then we move towards a sense of perhaps social obligation, that it's obliged that I would do this for the sake of the group or the wider benefit that my giving could have on society. These are egocentric, or at best sociocentric, ways of thinking about generosity. When people are involved in your ministry, they begin at this level in many cases, especially if you're working with people who've not had any church experience background, faith community experience background. Their spirituality in this area may be very, very underdeveloped. So they think of the dollars that they may put in an offering plate as kind of paying for services rendered, right? There was childcare, and so here's a few bucks to cover the babysitting for this morning's worship service time, or here's a few bucks to cover the sermon that the pastor, I guess, had to spend a couple of hours preparing, and so they're paying for services rendered. As people grow and understand that they are stewarding that which God has given them, they move towards a sense of social satisfaction, that it feels good to make a contribution to the betterment of or the advancement of a social objective. And as they truly enter into a God-centered frame of mind around giving, they think of it as an act of obedience and ultimately as an act of worship. And they are now giving. Giving comes out of a spirit of generosity. They've taken hold, to use Paul's words, of the life that's truly life with Timothy. This little diagram may be something that's helpful for you as you go forward. I have some action areas coming out of this first session. They're on this final slide. Take some time and study the stewardship texts of the Bible. Develop a Bible study or perhaps a sermon series, maybe a small group study based on this basic biblical teaching. Let it seep deep down into who you are. Get the Henry Nouwen book and read it, because Nouwen has many, many more biblical texts to support these same basic principles. And then maybe the second action area is to take an inventory of your own life as a steward. I mean, what commitments do you need to make to be an authentic leader and a promoter of a stewardship lifestyle? As you're talking to a donor, as you're communicating to your people, you want to be able to communicate out of your experience that God has led you in your quiet reflection before the Lord. God has led you to make a commitment to give, to be a giver. God's growing you, and to be able to share authentically around your own pathway, your own growth commitments, your own formation as a steward with those that you ask to join you in this venture, not only of faith and church planting, but also to join you in this venture of stewardship. That rings as authentic and winsome and compelling, the way we all want to be leading. Thanks for this first session. I hope that this is encouraging to you, and we'll be ready to start the next session when you've worked through these action areas and want to join us. Bye for now.